The year was 1867, a year that to most would mean little more than another page in the long scroll of Victorian history. But for a quiet English village named Hollow Brook, it was the year a child began speaking with shadows. And for those who still whisper about him today, it was the year the ordinary turned into something deeply unsettling, a forgotten event that blurred the line between history and horror. The boy's name was Thomas Whitfield. He was 7 years old. By all accounts, he looked like any child of his time, small, pale, dressed in the stiff clothing of the era. Yet those who knew him soon began to claim that Thomas carried with him something unearthly, a creeping presence that grew stronger each passing day. This is where our story begins, in the unsettling history of a child lost in time, a child whose words should never have been spoken aloud. In Hollow Brook, life was simple. The town rested in a valley choked with fog, its cottages damp with age, its fields heavy with superstition. Families kept their curtains drawn at dusk, muttering prayers against the spirits that, they believed, roamed freely after sunset. Though London, far away, surged forward with factories and progress, villages like Hollow Brook clung to the old ways. Shadows were not simply the absence of light, they were watchers, keepers of chilling secrets. And in 1867, one child seemed to hear them whisper back. It began quietly. At bedtime, Thomas would speak softly to someone his parents could not see. His mother dismissed it as childhood play. His father, stern and practical, told him to stop. But the habit deepened. He spoke during meals, in the garden, even in church, pausing as if listening for an answer before responding. His words, when overheard, were not the nonsense of an imaginative boy. They were specific, detailed. And that was when the fear began to take root. The Whitfields were not a strange family. Farmers by trade, churchgoers by habit. Yet their neighbors soon noticed small changes. The curtains of their home remained closed even in daylight. Candles flickered in their windows long after midnight. And the parents themselves looked gaunt, shadows deep beneath their eyes, as though worn down by something no one else could see. In the Hollow Brook Parish records, there is still one brief entry from that year. It notes a troubling disturbance concerning the Whitfields in the autumn of 1867. No explanation follows. Just that phrase, as if the scribe himself refused to commit more details to paper. For collectors of forgotten events and unsolved mysteries, that single line has haunted historical archives for over a century. What we do know survives not in official documents, but in whispers and fragments, in old photographs, in stories retold by descendants, in the fear etched into the memory of the village. There is said to be one photograph of Thomas, a disturbing image taken by a traveling photographer that same year. At first glance, it appears ordinary. The boy seated stiffly in a wooden chair, eyes averted, lips pressed thin. But look closer, and the image changes. Around the edges of the frame are faint streaks, shapes like blurred faces hovering near his shoulders. Was it an accident of the camera, or something captured that should never have been seen? Those who have studied the image claim it grows more disturbing the longer you stare. Neighbors told uneasy tales. They claimed Thomas spoke in a forbidden language, guttural sounds that made no sense, yet left listeners chilled. Others swore he called out the names of villagers long dead: Margaret, drowned in the river years earlier; Daniel, crushed beneath a millstone before Thomas was even born. How could a boy know such details, unless the shadows themselves were feeding him their stories? His younger sister once told a visiting cousin that she felt someone breathing in her room at night, though no one stood beside her bed. The cousin, shaken, recalled finding Thomas one evening in the hallway, lips moving soundlessly, eyes locked on the far corner. As if something stood there, she whispered, and he was listening. This was an era when post-mortem photography was common. Families preserved the memory of vanished children in eerie photographs, dressing their lifeless bodies in Sunday clothes, arranging them as though asleep. It was a practice born of grief, but one that left behind disturbing images that now haunt collectors. In Thomas's photograph, however, death had not yet come. Yet those who saw it swore he looked as though he already belonged to another world. Look at the image again in your mind. At first glance, it is a normal Victorian portrait, stiff, colorless, fading with age. But study the darkened corner by his shoulder. Some claimed a face appeared there, faint, hollow-eyed, leaning close to whisper in the boy's ear. Others dismissed it as damage to the glass plate. Still, the unease remains. Was the child alone? Or did the camera capture the truth of what stood beside him? This is where dark history meets horror storytelling. The unsettling history of Thomas Whitfield is not simply about a child with an overactive imagination. It is about a mystery buried beneath parish records. A hidden truth in the folds of an old photograph. A reminder that shadows are not always empty. Sometimes they carry voices. Sometimes they listen. The year 1867 was only the beginning. What followed would unravel the Whitfield family, the village of Hollow Brook, and leave behind a story that refuses to die. A story of vanished children, haunted places, and whispers too dark to ignore. And this is only the first chapter. The whispers are only beginning. The village of Hollow Brook lay cradled in the shadow of the English hills, where fog rolled down the valleys like slow-moving specters. Its cobblestone streets were narrow, uneven, and perpetually damp. Wooden cottages leaned on each other as if seeking comfort, their windows darkened with grime and age. The villagers went about their lives quietly, yet beneath the surface simmered stories older than the buildings themselves. Forgotten events, unsolved mysteries, and whispers of vanished children hung in the air like a permanent mist. Hollow Brook was a place where shadows were heavier than they should be, where silence felt alive, and where the Whitfield family would soon become the center of a mystery the village would never forget. By the time Thomas Whitfield began speaking to shadows, the village already had a long history of strange happenings. Stories of haunted mills, of ghostly figures wandering the fields at dusk, and of families struck by unexplainable tragedies were passed down from one generation to the next. Children whispered of forbidden places behind the churchyard, and adults often shook their heads at these tales, but even they avoided certain paths at night. Hollow Brook, steeped in dark history, seemed the perfect place for a child like Thomas to emerge, though no one at first understood how or why. The Whitfields themselves were a quiet family of farmers, respected by most, though not particularly remarkable. They attended church, worked the fields, and kept to themselves. Yet, as Thomas's behavior became more peculiar, neighbors began to notice subtle changes in the family. The father, once commanding and calm, now walked with hunched shoulders, his face drawn with exhaustion. The mother, pale and trembling, clutched her son's small hands as if trying to anchor him to reality. And Thomas, small and pale, continued to speak with shadows as if drawn by some unseen force. It was in this village that the first serious rumors began to spread. At first, people whispered about a child talking to himself. Then came the stories of the names he spoke, names from the past, belonging to villagers long dead or forgotten. Margaret, who had drowned in the river decades earlier. Daniel, crushed under a millstone. Thomas's own great-uncle, who had vanished mysteriously one winter. How did a boy of 7 know these things? Villagers whispered of a sinister past lingering in the soil, of shadows that remembered the dead. Hollow Brook was no stranger to eerie details, but this was different. The village's geography added to the sense of unease. Thick woods bordered one side, where sunlight barely touched the ground, and the river carved a slow, winding path along the other. Abandoned cottages dotted the outskirts, some reduced to skeletons of timber and stone. The villagers believed the land itself retained memories, that the shadows of past tragedies clung stubbornly to the landscape. Thomas often wandered near these places, mumbling to himself, or pausing to listen to voices no one else could hear. At times, he would point toward empty windows or twisted branches, naming figures that no living eye could confirm. Hollow Brook's history was etched into its parish records, yet these records were sparse and often unsettling. Entries of sudden deaths, children lost without explanation, and strange accidents were common. In the case of Thomas, one such entry simply noted a troubling disturbance at the Whitfield household in 1867. No further details were given. But this single line would later become a focal point for historians and collectors of disturbing mysteries, an anchor for a story that refused to die. The village itself seemed almost complicit in Thomas's growing strangeness. Adults avoided the Whitfields' house, citing a feeling of wrongness that even the strongest among them could not articulate. Children, however, were drawn to Thomas, perhaps sensing the presence of something beyond comprehension. They reported seeing him converse with empty corners, reacting to sounds no one else could hear. Some claimed he knew secrets of the village that even the oldest residents had forgotten. Hidden wells, unmarked graves, places that had been lost in time. Hollow Brook, steeped in its own dark history, now held a new, living mystery. Yet, even as fear began to grow, the village could not look away. There was an undeniable pull to the story, as if the shadows themselves demanded attention. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones about strange families, about chilling secrets buried in old photographs, and about how Hollow Brook seemed to harbor a memory no one could escape. Every street, every river bend, every corner of the village seemed to whisper warnings to those who lingered too long. It was in this setting, a village of mist, memory, and fear, that Thomas Whitfield would come to life not just as a child, but as a symbol of a hidden truth. A child who connected the living to the dead, a conduit between the present and Hollow Brook's sinister past. And as the villagers watched, they began to wonder, how far would this child go? How deep did the shadows reach? The stage was set, the shadows thickened, and the village itself waited. And in the dark corners of Hollow Brook, Thomas continued to speak. His words carried with them the weight of forgotten events and a promise of mysteries yet to unfold. The first whispers began quietly, almost imperceptibly. It was late in the summer of 1867 when Thomas Whitfield, barely 7 years old, first started speaking to no one at all. His parents initially assumed it was the idle chatter of an imaginative child, the kind of innocent fantasy that every small boy indulges in. But the words were not idle. They were precise, deliberate, and at times, chillingly familiar to anyone who listened closely. At night, Thomas would sit by the window, staring into the darkened yard. He spoke softly, articulating full sentences in a tone that was neither playful nor frightened. "Margaret is waiting by the river," he whispered one evening. "She says it is time." His mother, Eliza Whitfield, paused by the door, heart pounding. Margaret? The girl who had drowned in the river decades before. How could Thomas have known? The first conversations were subtle, almost dismissible. He would murmur under his breath while drawing in the dirt yard, naming the trees and fences as though they held long-forgotten memories. Sometimes he would point toward empty corners of the room, nodding or shaking his head as though listening to an invisible companion. "Daniel says we must go," he told no one in particular one afternoon, his small hand raised toward the shadow beneath the staircase. Daniel, of course, was the mill worker crushed years earlier, whose death had left the town in mourning. Neighbors began to notice. At first, it was the way Thomas wandered alone, muttering in tones too adult for his years. Then came the moments when he spoke aloud in the streets, seemingly addressing someone who was not there. Villagers reported hearing him call names that had been long forgotten, people who had vanished from Hollow Brook entirely. Even the local children, usually fearless, began to avoid him. Whispers circulated. "The boy speaks with the dead," they said. "He knows things no one should know." Eliza Whitfield grew anxious. She tried to explain it away to her husband, Thomas's father, George. "It's imagination," she said. "Children talk to themselves all the time." But George was not convinced. He had noticed the small, unsettling details, the way Thomas seemed to anticipate events before they happened, the way he could describe rooms in neighboring houses he had never visited. Something was happening in their home that could not be explained by simple childhood fancy. Thomas's father tried to intervene. He would call his son, urging him to speak clearly, to describe what he was doing. And when Thomas obeyed, it became even more unsettling. He spoke of figures in the corners, people whose faces were pale and twisted. "They want the ribbons," he said once, voice trembling. Margaret dropped them when she fell. They want them back. His parents exchanged glances, fear taking root where patience had once been. The first conversations were also punctuated by silence. Long stretches of it, where Thomas would stop speaking altogether, eyes fixed on the shadows at the edge of the room. Visitors to the Whitfield home reported a strange sensation, a heaviness in the air, as if the house itself were holding its breath. And then he would speak again, often referencing the past in unnervingly vivid detail. He would describe the way a river flowed decades ago, the color of a dress long rotted, the voice of a woman who had died in the neighboring village. Historians who examine these accounts note a disturbing pattern. The boy's knowledge often correlated with post-mortem photography and parish records. Names, ages, and incidents that seemed inaccessible to a living child were described in exacting detail. Collectors of old photographs and forgotten events have long speculated that Thomas had some connection to the past, a conduit between the living and the dead, a boy whose words preserved the memory of Hollow Brook's vanished children. Yet it was not just what he said, but how he said it. His tone could shift suddenly, from playful to mournful, from curious to accusatory, as if the shadows themselves were speaking through him. On several occasions, witnesses claimed they saw him glance behind them, lips moving without sound, nodding to someone only he could see. The small movements were subtle, but they conveyed an eerie awareness beyond his years. One particularly chilling afternoon, Thomas approached his mother in the kitchen. "They are here," he said, voice low. "All of them. They've come to show me the door." Eliza froze, staring at him. "The door?" she asked. Thomas nodded, eyes wide, trembling. "The door to the other side. I must go soon, or they will take me without waiting." It was in these first conversations that the Whitfield family realized the extent of the mystery that had settled over them. This was no ordinary child. Thomas was speaking a forbidden language, one only the shadows understood. And as the day stretched into weeks, his words became increasingly difficult to ignore. They were filled with hints of forgotten tragedies, hidden truths, and the sinister past of Hollow Brook itself. By the end of that first autumn, Thomas's conversations had transformed the Whitfield household into a place of tension and fear. The neighbors whispered, the children avoided the house, and even the village priest began to take notice. It was clear that Thomas had crossed some invisible threshold. His words were no longer mere murmurs. They were warnings, echoes of history reaching forward through the voice of a child. And yet, no one knew how far these conversations would go, or what darkness they were summoning. The year was still 1867, and by now, Thomas Whitfield's conversations with shadows had become the unsettling heartbeat of Hollow Brook. But it was the photograph that changed everything, the image that historians and collectors of dark history still whisper about today. A photograph that should not have existed, and yet did, capturing a boy and the invisible horrors that followed him. A traveling photographer had arrived in Hollow Brook that summer, offering families the novelty of a portrait. The Whitfields, like many others, agreed, hoping for a simple keepsake. Thomas was seated stiffly on a wooden chair, dressed in his Sunday best, the sunlight from the window falling across his pale face. At first glance, it appeared ordinary, a boy with an awkward smile, a hand resting lightly on his knee. Nothing more than a typical Victorian photograph. But hidden within the shadows of the image was something far more sinister. Look closely at the photograph. At first, it seems like nothing more than an old, faded image. But in the corner, behind the boy's shoulder, there are shapes. Blurred figures. A shadow, unnaturally thick, like a smear of darkness on the glass plate. Some claim to see the face of a girl, hollow-eyed and faint, as though pressed against the edge of reality. Others swear there is a man standing slightly apart, his features twisted in a way no living person could appear. The most unnerving detail? These figures were invisible to the human eye when the photo was taken, yet they appeared on the plate as if they had been waiting, captured by the camera's unforgiving lens. Thomas's parents, George and Eliza, were the first to notice something was wrong. When they looked at the photograph, their eyes seemed drawn to the shadows behind their son. "Who is that?" Eliza asked, her voice trembling. Thomas's response was calm, almost too calm. "They came to see me," he said. "They are here, like always. Don't worry, they mean no harm." But the fear in his mother's eyes betrayed her disbelief. She had seen her son staring into empty corners for weeks, whispering to voices no one else could hear. And now, they were immortalized in a photograph. Collectors of post-mortem photography and old photographs of vanished children have long debated the nature of the image. Was it a trick of early photographic technology? A double exposure? Perhaps, but those who have handled the original plate describe a weight to it, a sense that the darkness in the corners is not merely ink or chemical reaction, but something alive. Even the slightest tilt of the plate seemed to shift the shadows, to deepen them. Some claim they could feel eyes following them when they stared at it for too long. The photograph's existence spread through Hollow Brook quietly at first. A few villagers saw it, then others. Fear traveled faster than gossip. The children avoided the Whitfield household, and adults crossed the street rather than meet the boys' gaze. Yet despite the mounting unease, the photograph became a fascination. People were drawn to it, unable to look away, compelled to study the shadows and search for hidden details. Every viewing seemed to reveal something new. A hand resting on Thomas's shoulder where no one should have been, a dark outline hovering above the floor, a faint whisper of motion caught forever on the glass. Historians later noted that the figures in the photograph corresponded to names Thomas had been speaking aloud in his nightly conversations. Margaret, the girl who drowned, Daniel, the mill worker, and others whose lives had been recorded in perished documents, forgotten stories, or simply erased from memory. The photograph appeared to validate everything the boy had been saying, a terrifying confirmation that he had never been imagining the shadows, that he was never alone, and that the past itself had somehow touched the present. The Whitfields themselves were tormented. They debated whether to destroy the photograph, but a strange compulsion held them back. The boy seemed drawn to it, as if the image itself was a portal, a bridge between worlds. Sometimes he would sit for hours, staring at the shadows, speaking softly in his forbidden language, and the air in the room would grow heavy, almost suffocating. Even the family's most skeptical friends began to feel it. The house itself seemed alive, attuned to the image, to Thomas, to something older than any living soul. It was not just a photograph. It was a reminder of Hollow Brook's sinister past. Forgotten events were captured within it, chilling secrets rendered in silver and shadow. The image spoke of vanished children, of haunted places, of memories no one wished to confront. To the villagers, it was both a proof and a warning. The unseen world was nearer than they thought, and sometimes it spoke through the mouths of the living. Look again at the photograph in your mind. Notice the corners, thick with shadow, the faint, twisted faces, the sense of movement where none should exist. Imagine that every one of Thomas's whispered conversations had been immortalized here, that the unseen figures he spoke to had finally been given form. Some claim that those who stare too long hear whispers in their own ears, echoes of Thomas's forbidden language, fragments of messages meant only for the shadows. And yet, Thomas was still alive. He continued to speak, to wander, to listen. The photograph, so clear in its disturbing detail, captured only the beginning of a story far darker than any village record could convey. Every shadow, every figure, every faint smile hidden in the corners was a prelude to the horrors that would follow, to a tale of a child, a family, and a village entwined with history too unsettling to ignore. The year was 1867, and Hollow Brook had grown used to Thomas Whitfield's strange behavior. But the villagers were only beginning to understand the depth of the horror. By now, the boy's whispers had grown more precise, more urgent. No longer idle murmurs or childish imaginings. His words carried the weight of forgotten tragedies, the hidden truths of a village that refused to forget the dead. Thomas spoke of people who had long vanished from Hollow Brook. Margaret, the girl who had drowned in the river decades earlier. Daniel, the mill worker crushed beneath a millstone. Others, names lost in parish records, whispered by no one but Thomas. He spoke of their lives, their final moments, even the objects they had left behind. At first, villagers thought it was coincidence, perhaps overheard stories retold. But the details were too exact, too vivid to be mere imagination. This was not a child playing with history, he was speaking to it. At night, Thomas would stand in the corner of his room, eyes wide, lips moving silently, as if carrying on a conversation that no one else could hear. Sometimes he laughed, a hollow, childlike sound that carried unease down the hallway. Other times he cried, tears running silently as he told stories of accidents, drownings, and untimely deaths. His parents, exhausted and fearful, could only watch, powerless to intervene. The boy seemed connected to the dead in a way that no explanation could satisfy. The villagers began to notice. Children reported hearing him call out names during play, pointing to empty spaces as if his friends were invisible companions. Adults, at first skeptical, began to see him pause and glance at corners, tilting his head as though listening to something beyond their understanding. Even the parish priest, a man of faith, could not dismiss the fear that seemed to cling to the boy like a second skin. He spoke of a presence in the Whitfield household, an aura of unease that no candle, prayer, or blessing could dispel. Thomas's own words grew darker with each passing week. "They are here," he whispered one evening, pointing toward the hallway. "They want me to show them the way." His mother clutched his hands, trembling. "Who?" she asked. He looked at her with wide, unblinking eyes. "The ones who cannot rest, the ones the river took, the ones who never left Hollow Brook. They are waiting." Historians who examine Hollow Brook's old records have noted a chilling alignment. Parish entries of accidental deaths, drowned children, and unmarked graves coincided almost exactly with the names Thomas spoke aloud. This was not simple coincidence. The boy was recounting the lives of those long dead, and in some cases, he described details that had never been recorded. He spoke of injuries, expressions, and small objects, the color of a ribbon, the pattern of a shirt, the final words of a mother in mourning. How could a child know these things? Some have called it a forbidden language, the voice of the dead speaking through the living. The Whitfields were caught in a slow, unrelenting terror. Nights were long, days unbearable. Thomas wandered the house, muttering to the shadows, occasionally smiling at nothing and pointing as if the figures spoke back. His younger sister claimed she felt cold fingers brush her shoulder, or that whispers in an unknown tongue lingered near her bed. Friends of the family began to avoid the home entirely, fearful of what they could not see but somehow felt. The village itself became a place of suspended fear, as if Thomas's connection to the dead had reached beyond the walls of the Whitfield home. Some evenings, Thomas would leave the house entirely, walking the cobblestone streets alone, speaking softly. Villagers reported hearing him call out the names of the dead, voices carried faintly in the fog. Some swore they glimpsed faint shapes following him, shadows that moved independently, lingering at the edge of lantern light. Others insisted it was their imagination, yet the pattern repeated night after night. Even the church bell seemed to toll differently when Thomas passed, a hollow resonance that unsettled those nearby. Collectors of disturbing images and forgotten photographs claim that Thomas's story left a trace in old portraits and snapshots. In one image, the boy stands near the doorway, looking at nothing, yet figures appear blurred around him, a visual echo of the whispers he carried. Post-mortem photography of the period often captured children long dead with faces frozen in lifelike repose. Thomas, however, was alive, and yet he seemed haunted by the same presence. The photograph became both proof and warning. The dead were never gone. They lingered, and sometimes they spoke. The whispers of the dead were no longer confined to Thomas alone. The village of Hollow Brook began to feel the pull of the unseen. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, rooms felt heavier, and even the wind seemed to carry faint echoes of names long forgotten. Thomas's voice was the conduit, the channel through which history, horror, and mystery converged. The boy was not merely unusual, he was a living bridge to Hollow Brook's sinister past. And yet, no one knew how far this connection would extend, or how deeply the shadows would reach. The dead were whispering, and Thomas Whitfield was listening. By the winter of 1867, the Whitfield household had begun to crumble. What had started as whispered conversations between a boy and shadows had grown into something that gripped the family in a slow, unrelenting terror. Hollow Brook had become a village of hushed voices and fearful glances, but within the walls of the Whitfield home, the darkness was alive. The family itself was unraveling, thread by thread, under the weight of Thomas's presence and the secrets he seemed to carry. George Whitfield, once a steady, resolute man, became pale and withdrawn. His eyes, once sharp and confident, now carried a haunted look, as though he had seen the edges of some forbidden truth. He wandered the halls in silence, speaking less to his wife and children, avoiding the gaze of neighbors who dared approach. He was a man caught between disbelief and terror, unable to reconcile the normal world he knew with the unnatural presence his son had awakened. Eliza Whitfield fared no better. Her health declined rapidly, her movements frail and trembling. She spent hours by the fireplace, clutching her son as he spoke to the shadows, muttering softly to the invisible figures he called friends. Friends, she realized with growing horror, who should never have existed. Her mind teetered between maternal concern and a creeping fear that the boy she loved was being consumed by forces beyond comprehension. The family's home, once warm and inviting, now smelled faintly of damp wood and candle smoke, and every corner seemed charged with unseen attention. Thomas's younger sister, Mary, was terrified. She avoided her brother's room, claiming that the shadows breathed near the doorway and whispered her name. At night, she would lie awake, listening to the faint murmurs of her brother conversing with invisible companions. She tried to tell her mother, but Eliza was often too exhausted, her own mind fraying under the constant pressure. Even the family dog refused to enter certain rooms, growling at empty corners where Thomas paused mid-conversation, staring at nothing with a chilling intensity. The village took notice, as did the church. Hollow Brook had always been steeped in superstition, but by now, fear had turned into avoidance. Neighbors crossed the street when they passed the Whitfield home. The local priest visited reluctantly, claiming he felt a presence in the air that chills the soul. He attempted blessings, prayers, and last rites in the hope of protecting the family. But even he admitted that the household felt touched by something older, darker, and unyielding. Hollow Brook itself seemed to recoil from the Whitfields, as though aware of the sinister past converging in their home. Inside, the decline was more subtle, but no less frightening. Meals were forgotten, as Thomas often wandered into corners, speaking softly in a language that sounded both familiar and forbidden. Candles were left burning long into the night, creating shifting shadows that danced across walls in unnatural patterns. The parents argued less, and when they did, it was brief and strained, their words edged with exhaustion and fear. The house became a living record of the boys' interactions with the unseen, and it demanded attention, obedience, and fear in equal measure. Sometimes, Thomas would become silent for hours, staring at a darkened corner, lips trembling, eyes wide and unblinking. His parents feared he was speaking with someone or something that could not be seen by human eyes. Other times, he laughed, a hollow, unnatural sound that echoed in the hallways, making even the hardiest of villagers shiver. And always, the shadows seemed to grow longer, thicker, heavier, as if feeding on the family's unease. Historians who study Hollow Brook note the eerie parallels to other families whose children were said to communicate with the dead. In these cases, households often collapsed under the strain of fear and isolation. Sleep was interrupted by cries or murmurs. Meals were skipped. Family members fell ill under the pressure of invisible presences. The Whitfields fit this pattern perfectly. The house itself had become a place where history, tragedy, and horror converged, all centered around a single child whose voice had become the bridge between worlds. Thomas's behavior intensified as the weeks passed. He began naming places and people in the village no one else could recall. "They are waiting in the mill," he would say. "They follow the river at night. Do you see them?" His parents were forced to confront the possibility that their son's visions, his whispers and conversations with the dead, were not mere imagination. Something was communicating through him, something bound to the shadows and the forgotten events of Hollow Brook. By the end of the year, The Whitfield family had changed irreversibly. Fear had become the central force of their lives. The father, once rational and grounded, moved like a man carrying the weight of centuries. The mother, frail and haunted, spent hours watching the boy speak to the dark corners of the room. And Thomas himself remained a child, outwardly innocent, yet speaking with voices no one else could hear, forever entwined with Hollowbrook's sinister past. And yet, even as the family declined, no one could foresee the events to come, the disappearance, the whispers that would linger for generations, and the photograph that would immortalize the unseen horrors. The shadows had already claimed much, but their reach was far from complete. The year was 1867, and Hollowbrook was no longer just a village of mist and whispers. It had become a place where fear had tangible form, where shadows seemed to cling to every corner, and where a single child could hold the attention of both the living and the dead. Thomas Whitfield, now 7, had become the focal point of this creeping dread. Yet no place in the village would bear witness to his story more vividly than the parish church, a building that had stood for centuries, quiet, somber, and seemingly untouched by time. Until the incident. It was a cold autumn morning when Thomas's mother, Eliza, decided to bring him to church. She hoped, perhaps desperately, that the sanctuary's solemnity might calm the boy. The church was old, built of dark stone, with narrow stained glass windows that cast long, colored shadows across the pews. A heavy, familiar scent of candle wax and aged wood filled the air, and the faint echo of distant hymns seemed to linger even before the service began. For the villagers, the church was a place of comfort. For Thomas, it was another stage for the unseen. As the congregation gathered, Thomas grew increasingly restless. He shifted from foot to foot, muttering softly in his forbidden language, occasionally glancing at corners of the nave where no one stood. "They are here," he whispered to his mother. "They wait by the altar. Do you see them?" Eliza shook her head, clutching his small hand, her knuckles white. She could feel something, a heaviness in the air that no candle could pierce, a presence that pressed against the walls as if the church itself had become a vessel for something unseen. The priest, Father Langley, noticed the boy's unease immediately. Thomas had often been quiet in his sermons, but today he was different. His lips moved rapidly, words whispered in a tone too low for most to hear, yet clearly audible to those closest. And then Thomas pointed toward the altar, eyes wide and unblinking. "They have come to see the door," he said. The congregation, initially unsure whether the boy meant the church doors or spoke metaphorically, exchanged nervous glances. But there was a palpable tension, a collective sense that something was wrong. Suddenly, the air seemed to shift. Shadows stretched unnaturally along the stone floor, bending around pews and pillars. The stained glass windows, which normally painted the walls with warm hues, now cast shapes that seemed distorted, faces half-formed in the fractured light. Thomas's murmurs became louder, almost insistent. "Step aside," he commanded softly, addressing the shadows themselves. "Let them pass. They are waiting." The priest approached him cautiously, hand extended. "Thomas," he said gently, "look at me." But the boy did not move his gaze from the far corner near the altar. It was then that the first audible voice emerged, not from Thomas, but from the shadows themselves. A faint, indistinct whisper that seemed to ripple through the church, brushing against the eaves and settling into the pews. The congregation shivered. Candles flickered violently, some extinguishing entirely, plunging parts of the nave into darkness. Parents grabbed their children, murmuring prayers under their breath. Thomas, however, remained calm, standing as if conducting a conversation with entities only he could see. The whispers became clearer. Names were spoken, names that had not been uttered in Hollowbrook for decades. Margaret. Daniel. Thomas's great-uncle Edward, who had vanished one winter. Each name was spoken with sorrow, urgency, and a weight that pressed on the hearts of the living. Even Father Langley, man of faith and reason, felt an icy chill crawl along his spine. It was one thing to believe in spirits. It was another to hear them speak through the voice of a child standing in the center of the church. At the moment of peak disturbance, Thomas turned abruptly toward the congregation. "They want the door," he said, his voice trembling but firm. "They want to leave." Some claim the air became unbearably cold, a sudden gust of wind moving through the church without explanation. Candles snuffed out entirely, leaving only dim light from the overcast sky filtering through the stained glass. A few villagers swore they saw shadows shift independently, shapes bending, leaning, and retreating as if obeying the boy's words. The priest tried to calm the crowd. He urged them to pray, to hold hands, to reaffirm their faith. But the incident left a mark that would linger for years. Hollow Brook was no longer merely a quiet village. It had become a place haunted by whispers, by shadows, and by the memory of a child who spoke for the dead. Thomas's first conversation with the congregation proved that his connection to the unseen world was growing stronger, and that the boundaries between past and present, life and death, were thinner than anyone could have imagined. When the church service ended, Thomas walked silently back home, eyes still fixed on invisible corners, lips moving in subtle murmurs. The villagers left behind in the nave would not speak of what they had heard or seen for months. Some avoided the church entirely. Others left Hollow Brook altogether. And Thomas, ever come, seemed to carry the weight of Hollow Brook's haunted history in his small frame. That day, the shadows had spoken, the dead had whispered, and the village had witnessed the beginning of something that would grow beyond comprehension. Hollow Brook would never forget the incident at the church. And neither would Thomas Whitfield. The year was still 1867, and Hollow Brook had grown accustomed to whispers and shadows, though no one had grown brave enough to fully understand them. But the events of late autumn marked a turning point, an incident that would haunt the village for generations. The vanishing of Thomas Whitfield's friend, a boy who had once dared to follow him into the fog-laden woods. The child's name was Edward Clark, no older than 8. A quiet boy, pale and curious, with eyes that seemed to catch the dim light of the Hollow Brook streets like shards of glass. Edward had been drawn to Thomas, fascinated by his uncanny knowledge of the village, by the forbidden language he whispered, and by the eerie shadows that seemed to answer his every word. Children of Hollow Brook often avoided Thomas, sensing that the boy walked between worlds. Edward, however, was different. He followed willingly, his innocence oblivious to the danger lurking in every corner. It was a cold afternoon when they slipped away from the village. The fog hung low over the fields, a shifting curtain of gray that clung to the grass and crept along the edges of the woods. Thomas led the way, whispering softly in his strange, forbidden language. Edward trailed closely, curiosity guiding his steps, while the shadows moved around them with a subtle intelligence, bending, stretching, and following like silent guardians of a world unseen. At first, it seemed harmless. The boys wandered past the riverbank where Margaret had drowned decades earlier, past the abandoned mill that had claimed Daniel, the mill worker, and deeper into the forest where the trees grew thick and the sunlight could barely touch the ground. Thomas paused occasionally, listening, tilting his head, speaking in low tones. Edward watched with wide eyes, sensing the weight of something ancient and unyielding. And then it happened. Edward saw it first, a figure in the shadows, pale, indistinct, yet undeniably human in form. It shifted and pulsed as though it were alive yet not alive, leaning toward Thomas, who nodded calmly. "They want you," Thomas whispered. Edward froze, a chill crawling along his spine. He tried to call for help, but no sound left his lips. The figure advanced, and the shadows around it thickened, stretching unnaturally across the forest floor. Edward's last memory was Thomas turning toward him, lips moving in that soft, forbidden language, his small hands raised as if conducting the unseen. Then, the shadows enveloped him. One moment he was standing on the muddy path. The next, he was gone. Not a scream, not a struggle, only silence, broken only by the whispering leaves and Thomas's calm, small voice repeating names no living child should know. When Edward's parents discovered his absence, panic gripped Hollow Brook. The village organized search parties, scouring the woods, the river, and the abandoned mill. But no trace of the boy was ever found. No footprints led away, No tracks led to the water, no sound betrayed what had happened. It was as if Edward had simply vanished into the shadows themselves, a cruel echo of the stories Thomas had been whispering for months. The Whitfields were devastated. George Whitfield raged against the unseen, accusing anyone and anything of taking the boy. Eliza could barely speak, caught between grief and terror, her eyes constantly drawn to the corners where Thomas stood, whispering to the invisible. Thomas, however, remained disturbingly calm. He spoke of Edward as though he had merely stepped into another room, saying, "He is with them now. They are kind to him. He is learning." The parents' horror deepened. They realized their son was no longer just a conduit for the dead. He was an agent in a world beyond comprehension, a bridge to shadows that swallowed the living. Historians and collectors of disturbing mysteries have long examined the tale of Edward Clark. Some claim that the boy's disappearance mirrors other incidents of vanished children in Hollow Brook, suggesting a pattern, a connection between Thomas, forbidden language, and the shadows themselves. In every case, the children were drawn to places of past tragedy, moving toward the unseen, until they simply ceased to exist. Photographs taken afterward often show vague shapes in the background, blurred and distorted, as if attempting to capture what no camera could fully render. The village, already haunted by whispers and shadows, never fully recovered. Edward's disappearance became a cautionary tale, told in hushed tones to children who dared stray too far into the fog. Hollow Brook itself seemed altered, the woods darker, the river more silent, the abandoned mill more foreboding. Even Thomas, small and pale, seemed changed. He spoke less often, but his words carried weightier meaning, heavier than before, as though the shadows had grown more possessive, more insistent. And yet, despite fear, Edward Clark was never truly forgotten. The boy's absence lingered like a stain on Hollow Brook's history, a reminder that the past, the dead, and the shadows are never truly gone. Thomas Whitfield had crossed a threshold, the line between the living and the vanished, and the village would feel its consequences for decades to come. Hollow Brook learned that day that shadows could claim the innocent, that whispers of the dead could manifest in the living, and that a child could become the harbinger of the unimaginable. Edward had vanished into the darkness, leaving only Thomas, the boy who kept talking to shadows, to carry the memory of what was lost. The year was now nearing the end of 1867, and Hollow Brook had become a village haunted not only by its history, but by the living embodiment of that history. Thomas Whitfield. The whispers of the dead, the vanished children, the shadows that seemed to breathe, all of it had coalesced into a force that none could escape. The Whitfield family had declined, Edward Clark had vanished into darkness, and the village itself carried a new weight of fear. Yet it was only in the aftermath that the true legacy of Thomas Whitfield, and the shadows he spoke to, began to unfold. The village elders spoke quietly of the boy's gift, or curse, depending on how one chose to see it. Thomas's whispers had revealed truths that had been buried for generations, unmarked graves, accidents long forgotten, and secrets that had been deliberately hidden from history. Forgotten photographs, records of vanished children, and eerie family stories now took on new significance. Every corner of Hollow Brook seemed to hold a memory, a warning, a connection to what Thomas had awakened. And the villagers, though wary and fearful, could not ignore it. Historians who later studied the events called it a rare and disturbing instance of a child who functioned as a medium, a conduit between the living and the dead. Yet even scholars could not explain why Thomas had been chosen, why he could speak in a forbidden language that the dead seemed to understand, or why the shadows responded to his every word. Some whispered that it was the soil of Hollow Brook itself, saturated with tragedy and forgotten events, that had awakened him. Others claimed that Thomas's bloodline carried a latent sensitivity to the past, a gift passed down from ancestors whose own lives were intertwined with the village's sinister history. The Whitfield family never recovered. George Whitfield remained a hollow figure, wandering the village with eyes that reflected fear he could never speak aloud. Eliza Whitfield, fragile and trembling, often spoke to no one, as if conversing with ghosts who had followed them home. Thomas himself remained small, pale, yet unnervingly composed, a child who knew too much and who had seen too far. His words continued to echo in Hollowbrook long after they were spoken, carried in whispers by those who had heard them, preserved in diaries and letters, and captured faintly in photographs that seemed to shimmer with shadows when examined closely. The village itself changed. Hollowbrook was no longer merely a quiet, fog-laden hamlet. It had become a place of quiet dread. Paths once safe became ominous in the mist. The river that had claimed Margaret and drawn Edward into shadows became a symbol of unseen forces. The old mill, abandoned and rotting, was avoided entirely. Even the parish church, once a sanctuary, carried the memory of Thomas's first conversations with the congregation, a chilling testament to the thin veil between the living and the dead. Visitors who arrived later in Hollowbrook reported a strange atmosphere. Travelers claimed that, at dusk, the village seemed alive with faint whispers. Shadows lingered unnaturally long along cobblestone streets. Some swore they glimpsed the pale figure of a small boy, lips moving as though speaking to someone invisible. And though decades had passed, no one could completely dismiss the feeling that Thomas Whitfield, or at least the legacy he had created, was still present, observing, listening, and continuing the conversation between worlds. The legacy of fear was also carried in physical artifacts. The photograph that should not have existed remained with the Whitfields for years, a frozen testament to the shadows. Old letters described vanished children, disturbing incidents, and unexplained phenomena. Even objects from Thomas's home, a chair, a small ribbon, a child's toy, were said to carry traces of unease, as if the presence that had once filled the house lingered in their very fibers. Hollowbrook had become a repository of unsettling history, a village where the past and present were inseparably intertwined. And yet, despite the fear, there was a fascination. Some villagers and scholars were drawn to the story, compelled to investigate the forgotten events, to study the whispers of the dead, and to attempt to understand the forbidden language that Thomas had spoken. Many left Hollowbrook with unease in their hearts, their sleep haunted by fleeting glimpses of shadows, their dreams populated by the vanished children and the boy who had kept talking to them. Thomas Whitfield's story became legend, a cautionary tale whispered to children, a subject of study for those obsessed with dark history and creepy storytelling. Yet even legend cannot fully contain the events. The boy, the shadows, the whispers, and the vanished, they persisted, a reminder that some histories cannot be buried, some mysteries cannot be explained, and some children carry a connection to a world beyond our own. Hollowbrook, once a village of ordinary life, had been transformed into a nexus of eerie details, chilling secrets, and the lingering presence of the unseen. And so, the legacy of fear endured, a testament to the thin line between innocence and horror, between life and the unseen forces that wait just beyond the edge of understanding. Thomas Whitfield had become more than a boy. He was a symbol of Hollowbrook's unsettling history, a reminder that the past speaks in whispers, that shadows remember, and that some children are chosen to carry the memory of the vanished. The year was 1867, and by now, the story of Thomas Whitfield had spread beyond Hollowbrook, whispered from one village to the next, leaving a trail of unease and fascination. The boy who spoke to shadows, who knew the names of the vanished, and who seemed to walk between the living and the dead had become more than a curiosity. He was a symbol, a living embodiment of Hollowbrook's darkest secrets and the unsettling history that lurked just beneath the surface of ordinary life. Thomas remained small, pale, and disturbingly composed, as if the passage of time held no meaning for him. His parents, George and Eliza, were shells of their former selves, each consumed in their own way by fear and exhaustion. The village continued to regard the family with wary eyes, a mixture of pity, terror, and fascination. And yet, Thomas's connection to the unseen had endured, a reminder that some mysteries cannot be contained or explained, no matter how much time passes. The legacy of what had occurred was preserved in photographs, letters, and local accounts. That infamous photograph, the one that should not have existed, remained a focal point for those who dared examine it. Look closely at the shadows within the image, and you can see the faint outlines of figures long vanished, faces pressed against the edges of the frame, hands reaching out, frozen in mid-motion. Every viewing felt like a conversation, a whisper from the past that carried the weight of decades. Even now, it is said that those who stare too long at the image can hear faint, indistinct murmurs, as though the dead themselves are speaking. Hollow Brook itself had changed. The fog seemed thicker, the river more foreboding, the abandoned mill darker than memory allowed. Children were warned to avoid certain paths, to stay close to home, and to speak nothing of what they saw in the shadows. Yet the whispers persisted, faint and persistent, in the wind, in the rustling of leaves, and in the silence of rooms where no one dared linger. The village became a place where the boundary between life and the unseen had thinned, a locus of dark history, strange families, vanished children, and chilling secrets. Historians and collectors of dark, forgotten events continue to debate the true nature of Thomas Whitfield's gift, or curse. Was it a conduit to the dead? A rare sensitivity to the echoes of history? Or was Hollow Brook itself cursed, a place where the past refused to remain buried? Records suggest that Thomas knew far too much for a child his age, speaking in a forbidden language that seemed to summon the echoes of the vanished. The shadows followed him, heeded him, and perhaps, in some unfathomable way, even protected him. The boy's story is intertwined with the village's own unsettling past. Forgotten photographs, post-mortem images, vanished children, and the whispered stories of the haunted all converge in the figure of Thomas. He was the living repository of Hollow Brook's memories, a child who carried the past in his voice, in his small hands, and in the gaze that seemed always to pierce beyond ordinary sight. Families, historians, and curious onlookers have attempted to reconstruct events, but the truth resists simplicity. The shadows do not yield. They do not explain. They remain, ever patient, ever watchful. Even decades later, tales of Thomas Whitfield echo in Hollow Brook. Some say he vanished, disappearing into the mist one evening, never to be seen again. Others claim he remained in the village, speaking still to the unseen, listening to the whispers of the dead, and watching the shadows move along the cobblestone streets. Whether gone or present, the legacy of his voice lingers, a warning to those who seek knowledge of forgotten events and disturbing mysteries. And so, the story concludes not with certainty, but with the persistence of the unknown. The whispers of Hollow Brook never truly fade. They live in photographs, letters, and the accounts of those who dared to witness the boy who spoke to shadows. They persist in the fog along the riverbank, in the stillness of the abandoned mill, and in the corners of rooms where no one dares linger. History, dark and unsettling, has a way of speaking to those who listen, and Thomas Whitfield was its most unwilling herald. The tale of the child who kept talking to shadows is a reminder. The past is never truly gone. Forgotten events, hidden truths, and chilling secrets remain, waiting for someone to notice. The dead have a way of speaking, even when no one is listening, and sometimes, the living carry their voices, whispers that drift through time, through houses, and through villages like Hollow Brook. As we leave Hollow Brook behind, consider this. Some photographs capture more than light, some children carry knowledge no one should hold, and some shadows remember. The boy's story is one of many, but it remains perhaps the most chilling. For in Thomas Whitfield, we see the boundary between life and death blur, a reminder that some mysteries are not meant to be solved, and some whispers never fade. The shadows are patient. The whispers continue. And somewhere, in the corners of our vision, the past waits to be remembered.